Hi, this is International Master and Author John Watson. This lecture series is presenting various repertoires for white and for black. And although these are mainly for inexperienced and average players, all of these systems that I'm showing have been played by grandmasters and usually a number of super grandmasters, and they are therefore playable on a very high level. This is the second lecture in our new repertoire series on the Queen's Gambit Declined for white. The idea is to play d4, d5. Now, this game was with knight f6, d4, d5, and knight f3 first before c4 for reasons I talked about before. And it's going to be followed, though, with c4 in most cases. So you're not playing a London system here, and you're not playing some system in which you don't play the move c4. So this is more like a mainstream kind of repertoire, but I'm showing you lines that avoid quite a bit of theory and hopefully make it fairly simple to introduce you to playing the Queen's Gambit Declined. And one idea of playing knight f3 is in fact to avoid things like the Albin counter gambit, for example, or even the Chigorin defense. You can still play knight c6, but it's not as compelling or dynamic as it is after knight f3, because here white doesn't have to play c4. White can play moves like bishop f4, g3, those kinds of moves. So that's kind of the basis for knight f3. And I'm also going to point out some other move order issues as I go along. Because knight f3 also means that black has some opportunities that he doesn't have against 2c4. So I'll show you those. And hopefully overall knight f3 will cut down on your learning time. That's the idea. And I'll try to point out other move order issues as we go along. So last week we began looking at the main line of our proposed repertoire, which was this basic position. Now we're starting with this. That's what this series is about, is the move e6 as opposed to c6, which we'll talk about in another series, or other things like d takes c4, the Queen's Gambit accepted. But right now we're looking at e6, the Queen's Gambit declined. And last week we started looking at the traditional move, bishop e7, which has been by far, either here in this order or by transposition, by far the most common move order in the systems that we're looking at. So we're going to spend quite a bit of time on this. And we will look at other moves, as I say, on move 2, 3, and 4. So we will look at other options, but this is the ultra-traditional and most popular variation. So what white plays now is this. That's our anti-Queen's Gambit declined move, and often this position will happen because white played bishop e7 on an early move, like the third move of the main line. For example, this is probably a lot of you know this. This is a very common line, and against that, it's in a way even easier to play bishop f4 because black's already been committed to bishop e7. And this is basically our starting position. I'm going to show a few more games here from this position because they're so instructive, and because the basic position, it's good to know it well in any case. I should say that I've been following some suggested move orders and some ideas in Graham Burgess's new book, or reasonably new book, A Cunning Chess Repertoire for White. And most of the time when I've been doing these series, I've been looking at just pretty much every book that there is and digging up ideas from all over the place, but I've been heavily leaning on Graham's book. Been a little lazier for this one, I guess, for this anti-Queen's Gambit declined part of the repertoire. I should also say I'm trying to keep these series as short and unconfusing as possible, which means I'm not going to give as many lesser moves and irregular sub-variations as I did in the earlier series. So if you really want to know about all the details, for example, the second, third, and fourth moves, we'll look at some of them. You'll want to study this variation in these lines on your own, and also to use some good books and databases. So, but we're going to cover the main things. We're going to cover the big things, and then hopefully you can fill out some of the rest of it on your own. Okay, so let's start with this game, which had a slightly different move order, namely these moves first, and then here we are back in the Queen's Gambit. Okay, so black plays this move c5. Now we were looking usually at castling e3 c5 first, just to show you that. And in this case it's not going to make any difference. He tries to move c5 first. White takes just like he did in the other lines. and black ends up castling anyway. Queen c2, we looked at that move because of the idea of attacking here indirectly, bringing a rook here, and even maybe looking at the king once it castles. And black's usually going to castle kingside in these positions, in fact does so right away. And white plays that move. Now white has castled queenside in this kind of position and has also played a3 in this kind of position. But we're looking at the combination of the moves a3 and rook d1. And it's the move order actually isn't even necessarily that important, except that in some lines black's queen won't go to a5, and which it does in the main lines. And in this line he does definitely go to a5. The idea is that he's kind of threatening knight e4, doubling pawns and freeing his position a little bit. The rook has room to go to d8 now, and basically there's just it's a good spot for the queen. There's even some little bit of pressure there, so you'll see white responding to that. And as you recall, the idea, you're not really threatening b4 because knight takes b4 followed by bishop takes b4 followed by knight e4. Those kinds of moves are quite good, and so that's b4 is not a threat yet. But and so therefore we saw the move rook d8, I believe, or we will see it if we haven't already. D takes c4 is a move. Bishop e7, simply retreating in anticipation of b4, is another well-known move. But in this game he goes ahead and he plays this knight e4 move, and it's very logical. It has the idea of doubling white's c-pawns and possibly weakening his queenside. So the drawback is that white can take advantage of the absence of this knight from f6 from the king side, and that means that black has to be careful about defending these queenside squares, especially because he's taking one extra move, or maybe even two, with that knight. So he's not developing quite as fast as he might in other positions. And speaking of the king side, this bishop is no longer on e7. It kind of drifted away from defense over here, and the queen has kind of snuck over away from the king side. So this is a line where maybe white sometimes is able to get a little bit of pressure. Okay, now that d5 pawn is hanging, so white has to decide whether to just develop or try to take that. And the way he does it this time is he actually just goes ahead and takes it. And now if white takes with the queen, we might end up with this position. If white wants that pawn structure, turns out he's much better off doing it this way. Now notice that bishop's pinned as far as taking this pawn. And so he takes it that way to get his pawn back. Probably he shouldn't get his pawn back. Probably at this point he should go more. Oh, by the way, look all of a sudden that we have a bunch of pieces that are sort of headed somewhere around this king side, right? And maybe some more here, like this one, and a lot of things can aim at that king side. So that's in line with the negative part of knight e4 that I talked about before. But taking with the pawn leaves the queen on the board therefore leaves attacking chances. Now black has ways of just making some moves and trying to win this pawn later. It's probably not going to go anywhere in the long run, and probably should have done that because this just gives him a little bit. He's a little too far behind in time now. Now there's a mate threat on h7, so he has to stop that. And then that nice move, which puts pressure right there on that f7 square, gets a piece out, gets ready to get castled. So good general move. In this game, black plays this move here, which has some good points. It attacks the rook and it defends a square that looks like it's well defended, but actually can get into trouble in a lot of lines. Let me just show you another game. One game went like this and this to get rid of the bishop, but strangely, just because it's a little bit slow, white has able to even though, and that's a very important attacking piece to get rid of. So you might think, okay, black's definitely achieved something here. The only problem is that white still is quite a bit better developed and has more space, and there are still these squares hanging around the king that are weak. So this position tends to favor white. The threat is rook d7, which puts a lot of pressure. It wins the 7th rank basically, and puts pressure on f7. So black tries to respond to that, for example, with this move. But then white goes here, and now he has a new threat. And the new threat is to play here, to capture. Threatening to capture and then play rook h5 check, right, on h7. So this move, I think, defends against that, but doesn't stop the kind of strange move here. That's a good answer. You could also just play double rooks, but I think this one's quite good because if king takes, rook takes, rook down here. We're on this and we're threatening bishop d6. Big problem. And if he just tries to defend like this or something, then we have this check. And the king is getting in a lot of trouble. Just for example, something like this. And you'll at least get your material back, and more. So, and if rook takes, the problem is then we still have, I believe, rook here because the rook in the corner is hanging. So I believe that will also be good. But actually, much easier than that. I was wondering why that was working. What he really should do is just that, and he's on the rook at the corner. So that shows you the kind of tactics that can come up. Instead of this, black didn't play b6. Black played knight there, which just drifts a little bit more towards the king side, and that's a good idea. White has nowhere particular to go. That comes up. Now this is a key point. Again, this knight f7 move is a problem. For example, if black goes there, white goes here. Black takes, and white goes here. And the queen's running out of squares. Has to go here, and then here. And now there's no way to defend that square. So white would win big material. So knight f7 is already a threat. And so he has to do something about that, and he tries this move. But then white can start drifting over towards the king side, and we have that problem we talked about earlier, that black doesn't have that many defenders of these weak squares, and white's got quite a few pieces drifting in that direction. In fact, it's pretty much, believe it or not, that's almost the only move, and we're getting to where it's really a winning game. This knight has nowhere to go now. All these squares are covered, and this one may be best, but it's an awfully negative position. So he tries that, and that's to cover f7. But as you'll see, this is really bad. That has no squares at all. Black was counting on that move, but he forgot about that move, which is check and attacks the queen too. And so there were just a couple more moves. White, one material is threatening f5. Played f5 here actually, and this game was over very quickly, as you can imagine. White's material is overwhelming, and he has an attack. So what did we learn there, if anything? Hopefully something, right? Okay, the opening was slightly out of order. There's our main line, and this transposes into something we saw before with e3 and queen c2, and black still defended with queen a5, which is generally considered the best move. And white played that key move with the idea that also stops, an embarrassing knight before at some point, if that could happen, and puts pressure. So now there is some pressure on the center, but there's also the idea of just developing. If white's next move, if black did some standard move like just rook d8 or something, it's probably going to be bishop e2, not even capturing on d5. Just so that you know. Okay, let's see the next game. Okay, now we're just going to look at the same line again. It's good. These Queen's Gambit themes are fairly common. Even though when the bishop on f4, sometimes the same themes come up as in other positions of the Nimzo Indian and the another Queen's Gambit declines. So he takes that thing on c5. The minute c5 is played, white grabs. That's kind of the principle. Otherwise, black's going to take and get a very easy game. So again, a little bit of an indirect attack here. Notice that black castled first this time, but it doesn't end up making any difference because he plays queen a5. And he plays a3. And this time he plays that move. I think I mentioned that move. And that's a pretty good move. That's actually been played a lot by very strong players, and it defends the king side for one thing. It means that bishop's kind of back where it should be, defending some of these squares. And it gets out of the way of b4. Although b4 wasn't an immediate threat, it would be one pretty soon. So it's a good flexible move. And white plays a good move here that actually was neglected for a long time, which is just very simply. So the combination of this, this, and this has actually kind of revived this line for white, and white's been doing very, very well with this line. It's very modest, but white has a little space advantage. This bishop is not very good, and black can't seem to free his game. And that's enough for white to claim just a very small advantage. So now, once again, we're going to see this move. And we're going to see this too. This is what we'd call the main line. Now that makes sense. In a lot of these openings, it's nice to make this piece move once and then take, and then so the piece has to move twice in order to recapture. So in other words, this is the main line. And at least white's had to move that piece for a second time, which hurts his development, and that's an advantage. On the other hand, black's essentially given up some of his grip over the center there and stands a little bit passively. But in this game, he goes and does what he did last time, and there's a difference here. Without the bishop being here, you'll see What happens here is that, okay, once again, black takes there, because this time he has to. Because if he takes this way here, he didn't have a chance to play knight takes c3, and he just loses a pawn and more. So he has to take that first, and now you might think he would do like he did last game and take back. The difference is that this is protected now. There's no rook d5, and that would still be weak. And in fact, white can play this. It's an interesting pawn structure. It's got some attacking chances, and sometimes you can even gambit a pawn. But we're not going to play it that way. We're going to do something different, which is considered slightly better, especially after this game, which is to play this move. Very, very simple. He's just going to try and get an endgame advantage. Now, why would this be an advantage when all you've done is give black a protected passed pawn on the outside of the board, and you have a weakness on c3? You might think this is kind of crazy. The real answer to that is centralization, development and centralization. This is a key move here. Whoops, excuse me, knight d4, because it covers so many central squares. It covers so many key squares, and it just means white's better centralized. He has this idea too about playing the bishop up here. This bishop has good central scope, and even the king can go here instead of castling. So this king is away from the center. Black's king on g8. White's king is going to be right in the middle of the fight. And then the other thing we're going to learn about this is that just in general, an advantage in the center is more important than an outside passed pawn in the ending. You'll see so many queen pawn openings where black gets that passed pawn, or maybe sometimes even two passed pawns. And if they aren't too far advanced especially, you'll find that they aren't as good as having the center. Now, he played a5 in this game just to get that pawn moving. Here's a good game to look at, instructive game. There's a couple games we're going to look at here. Okay, taking that way. You could conceivably take the other way, but this is better. This has more grip over the side of the board and opens up the... Now that's an interesting move because it does expose you along that diagonal. But if you look at it for a second, black's worried about where to put his pieces. I mean, if he makes a move like this or something, and white makes a move like this, then that's going to get opened up anyway. And what white's going to do is put a king here and a rook here. You'll see something similar to that. And these pawns are going to get very weak. And also d5 would come with tempo in some case like that. So what black does is he tries to get more active with that bishop where it can't be attacked as easily. And he does that by playing this move b6. And white plays here. And then I think now he realizes that this isn't going to work out very well because of this. This is awfully fast. Now if that bishop moves somewhere without taking anything, there's going to be a rook a1 and just capturing this pawn this way. Maybe black would have been counting on that, but then there's this problem. And then there's a lot of counterattack here. There's a lot of attacking pressure on black's position. So so what black does is he avoids that line and simply plays the other way, brings the bishop the other way, and then back again. But then he's run into that problem that we talked about, and then bishop here, and all of a sudden he can't defend his queenside squares, because after the rook moves somewhere, let's say there is where he actually did move in the game, there, these pawns can't all be defended. That's simple, really. So it's good to know that that pawn structure happens in the Grunfeld pretty often. It happens in the English opening fairly often, this kind of pawn structure, where those pawns look strong but actually end up being sort of weak. Now that's... Okay, in the game he played a5, where I was going to show you one other move here too, which is just retreating this, very logical. Maybe it'll go to f6 or something. And then he tries to simplify, just take some pieces off. You would think this would be easily drawn in some position like this until you start looking at it a lot and you realize how well centralized white is. And you can go over this and look for options. Now this time he takes that way to get the center pawns, powerful center pawns. He could take the other way. And that gives him two passed pawns on the queen side. But actually white's clearly better here because his pieces are just so much more active. His king's in a beautiful position in the middle of the board. And what happens here is black tries to bring his king over. Black's having trouble getting developed because that pawn's hanging. So he starts bringing his king over. And white takes over the file. Black tries to cover c7 from the rook coming down, but that doesn't really work all that well anyway, because white just starts advancing in the center. Black comes up. White goes here, can't take that because he's going to lose. If he takes that, he's going to lose a few pawns at least because of the 7th rank. And then I think white just goes here, yes, attacking this, and threatening rook c7. So if you look at rook c7 check, that's going to be a problem. For example, f6 here, king here. Now if you just move the bishop back, I think you're going to find this is absolutely killing. You know, attacking this. If he does go back here or something, you can always retreat this somewhere, maybe here, threatening this kind of thing. And then you're also threatening this kind of thing. Maybe that's the bigger threat, d5, d6. Central pass pawn. The one reason I'm showing you these examples is because the central pass pawn tends to beat flank pass pawns, especially in the ending. But obviously not in a king and pawn in game. So don't don't let me confuse you here. But as long as there's a fair number of pieces left and there's play on both sides of the board, the central pass pawns are extraordinarily good. Grunfeld defense, you'll see that just going on constantly. White winning games that look like they're fairly harmless, but that one central pass pawn will beat the fairly harmless flank pawns. Okay, so where does that leave us? Oh, I didn't show you the very end of that. But White basically just won a pawn and then went on to win the game. So in the game, Black just starts moving that immediately. You can see why. That does give White a nice outpost here, though, and it means that there's no way this pawn is going to end up supporting that A pawn. And White uses the same plan we were just talking about. He just swings both rooks over. This can also happen against two kingside pawns, too, on open files, where this kind of thing of having two rooks on open files against them not only holds them up, but ends up even targeting them and often winning them, pawns like that. Black simply defends. White tries that move. White also had just simply knight f5 was probably a pretty good move instead of bishop g5. Not that important. Just now he's made a little bit of a weakness, a little weak square there. And rook d8 turns out to be probably inaccurate because of that tempo that White just gained there. And White just has a complete bind on the position. If you look at this, he decides to just go ahead and take the bishops now. Doesn't really have to, but it's actually pretty good play because two bishops are going to win most of these endings anyway. But we have, in addition to that, we have a weakness here, somewhat of a weakness here, and great difficulty for Black to just kind of unwind his pieces. So let's see how that works. Now the king's going to go over to watch over that pawn. This is actually gets to be a kind of interesting position because it's a little hard to make progress here. I mean, one way to do it is get the king over here and then put the rook somewhere and start goofing around, or maybe goof around in the center. He finds a nice solution though, just that move. First of all, it does restrict the knight and the bishop from coming to active squares, so that was probably one of the main points. But the other point is that a lot of times when you've got your opponent tied down on one side of the board, and the queen side needs defending here for Black, it's often a good idea to open up another front. It's called opening a second front by attacking on, and usually the way you do that is you attack with your pawns on the other wing, the wing where both sides are probably maybe not even paying that much attention to yet. Certainly the defender has often moved away from that wing. So here there's all kinds of possibilities of breaking with moves like g5, f5 and g5, and then opening up some lines and quickly swinging back over. That's kind of the idea. So let's just see how that works out. White's in no hurry here. So he expands in the center first. And then again, there you go, the second front. This move could be quite good. Playing there, opening lines, and all of a sudden Black's going to have trouble adjusting to what White's doing. And White doesn't have to worry about this pawn too much because he can always put his king over here if he has to. So in fact he does that. He starts bringing the king over. And I'm just doing this because I don't want to. White could have gone faster by playing this move at some point and attacking this directly, as it turns out, but that's just a technical point. He's taking more time than he needs to in many ways. He should probably try and sit on it, but White has things like just doubling here, and what else would he do here? Bringing the bishop back and playing for f5. f5 is a strong move at some point. Maybe bishop f2, and then trying to see how to respond to f5, because that's sort of a bone in Black's throat. So there might be a g4 kind of idea. At any rate, you can always break through in these positions given time, but Black is very cooperative by doing this, because what happens is that opens up the h file, And in fact, so white goes there first, attacking this bishop. And in fact, right now, just the move rook h1 was absolutely decisive. Instead, he played that move first, a little slow, and black also made a move that was a little slow, and then this was decisive again. There's simply no answer to rook h8. So that was kind of interesting game. How did that happen? How did white get so much pressure there? Well, basically, we got our standard position, we got our standard idea of rook d1 to get pressure on the center, and black went into this endgame, and white was glad to go into it. And this endgame at first sight looks reasonably harmless. I mean, after all, white has the only overt weakness on c3, but it's a lesson in centralization. If you have the central advantage, and of course, this is the kind of game you really have to kind of take your time, look at, think about what other moves people could have made. But what it amounts to is that white can put a lot of pressure on this side of the board. He can double, he can put the bishop this way, and force this knight to move, either win the b pawn or else force maybe the exchange of that knight. And the minute the exchange of that knight happens, then we get to a position where the pawns are too strong. Now that's not quite how this worked here immediately, but it did come down to a position like that. So white got a big advantage in activity, and now two bishops. Two bishops will win most endgames anyway. But this was interesting here that at the very end here, he tried this thing about opening up a second front. First restricting the knight, because knights need to be kind of restricted in their movements. You notice the knight can't go here, 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 or here now. But also advancing and gaining space. Sometimes it's not even so much opening lines as it is just gaining space, and then opening lines very, very slowly. And that's what happened. So, well, he made him really white. Got through a little more easily than he should have, but this is a winning position. So, okay, let's see if we can at least get started on one more. Okay, some big names here. Kramnik and Carlsen. Kramnik, by the way, plays this, has played bishop for quite a lot. Carlsen has played it less than Kramnik, but he's played it almost as often as he has bishop g5. So this is not that obscure a move, especially at the top. And then we get our basic position again. And that's our basic counterattack. Now remember, we saw other moves. We saw a6, knight h5. We saw that idea. I should show you maybe another recent Kramnik game. This time Topalov was white and Kramnik was black. And Topalov played that move. I'm sorry, Kramnik played that move, and Topalov played this. We saw something similar, c5 versus that move, where it was really effective. This is actually sort of a main line now, and it's considered to slightly favor white. The game went like this. White went here. We know that trick. We know that idea. One idea is if he takes it, that knight's very nicely placed there, and we're attacking here. And we can play f4, for example. Positions like this are very nice. f4 and attack. And we've seen how to do that. So Kramnik's not about to do that. And if f6, we've seen that idea too. The point is that if he ever takes now, there's problems with the king side being weak. We saw several examples of that, like the Nakamura game. You can go back and look at that from last week. So what Topalov does is something more normal. In fact, this is actually sort of a book line, but I think white's better, and it was really shown by this game. And now this move, that may be new. Just trying to attack with this idea, maybe g4 and h5 even. Just very direct. And that kind of threat is getting quite serious, and so black really tries to block things off. White played this bishop retreat here, saving his bishop pair, and black started breaking up the queen side. So that looks good, but it turns out he can't get rid of that point there, that cramping pawn there, and so white retains some sort of advantage. Black tries this move, probably not the best move, but he wants to block that bishop off and maybe get a little bit of play this way, maybe even e5. It's logical, it's just that it doesn't work out that well. White simply castles, and now black does what seems awfully natural. He's trying to do what you always do in these positions, break up this pawn chain. The problem is there's sort of a semi-tactical problem with that. That move's very strong. And you can look at it for a while, but if he takes, there's this problem. And then this pawn's going to be there for quite a long time. But if he plays here, the pawn isn't quite as strong this time, but it's still pretty good. And white, in fact, goes out and defends it because that pawn is it's hard to get rid of. And so white has a definite advantage now. Um, Black tries to get rid of that, and somewhere there was probably a miscalculation here on Black's part. He probably thought he was just going to win this back and things were going to be okay, and maybe missed this move, this nice move, which happened next. It's not so much that you're winning, you know. It's not as though the fork is really the point. It's the point is that you've won some material with this. He played here, and so even though you lose that rook on f1, there may have just been a little miscalculation here. Taking here just doesn't do any good, as it turns out. White comes out much better, and so but after that he's able to block off this bishop, and all he has to do. And now there's a problem of bishop takes being a threat, and so in the end he just comes out a pawn ahead. Black is taking, and what happened was they exchanged this for this, and white had an extra queenside pawn. Right now he's two extra pawns, but he ended up losing this one. But it doesn't matter. White has an extra pawn and an advantage on the queenside, and managed to convert. So that was an important recent game in the candidates tournament, just from a month ago or so, or less than a month. And I see that the time has really gone on here, so that's kind of good. We've seen a short game there, but I'll show you the main game here, the Kramnik-Carlsen game, when we come back next week. Thanks.